Hi, with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the wider concept of risk reward and how do we assess the risks that we undertake for the reward that we're going to receive. Now, some of these can be fairly obvious. You know, it's a hot day, we're thirsty, and we drink some water, and it's low risk, and the reward's good because we don't feel thirsty anymore. But I'm talking about where the risk is clearly obvious, and where we have to balance, maybe in fine judgment, balance what that risk and reward is. If we engage in this level of risk, are we prepared to do it? What are the chances of us surviving that risk? And who among us and how many among us are prepared to undertake that level of risk, and what sort of mental preparation or training or whatever do we need to undertake that. Now, you know, a very high risk. So I'm going to explore this in its widest possible sense and use different examples. Now, let's say in a military sense, where the risk is obviously very high. You know, somebody might shoot you, for goodness sakes, or you may get part of your body blasted off into oblivion. So the risks are high, either through death or being maimed and crippled and so on. Now, there may be those that think their life isn't really worth living, and they're prepared to take high risk, but that's only in a self-destructive sense. That's not somebody who's courageously pursuing some goal. There can be people believing, very deeply in their cause, like how the Islamic hordes in some of those medieval battles, or even in, say, in the Sudan in the late 1890s, when a large Muslim army was doing battle with a much smaller British army, and the Muslim hordes just tried to charge down the machine guns and those sorts of things. Things that you saw even in World War One with white Western people trying to charge down the machine guns, which each day we look at and go, "You've got to be kidding!" But nonetheless, so there's not in every instance do people carefully balance and weigh the risk reward. Some are following instructions, others ideologically driven, and so on. But the concern for their own welfare has to reach a point where they're prepared to accept that the risk, whether they think they're performing some greater good, whether the risk is acceptable. Now, if you look at the amount of bullets expended, say, in World War One or in any of the Vietnam War, look at the amount of bullets expended and the amount of sort of casualties, deaths and casualties, then you're looking at somewhere around 1% or even slightly less of the bullets fired out of the guns are actually hitting something, hitting the enemy or an enemy soldier. So out of every 100 bullets, only one, let's assume one, we'll round off the numbers here, but one bullet is hitting. Now, is that because people aren't taking aim? Is it because they're just shooting random? Now, if you look at the Vietnam War, where you or other wars where you've got a high risk of snipers getting you if you stick your head above the parapet or above the sandbag wall or something, then what a lot of soldiers were doing is they were just holding their automatic weapons, their rifles over their heads, not showing their heads or their bodies, just holding a rifle up and just rando shooting. And this was as much to be a deterrent for the enemy so that the enemy wouldn't try and charge down your position, but it was hardly likely to hit anything. It was just done for show and deterrence. The same goes for say, now as technology of warfare increased, the chances are your enemy would be further away in the distance. So you'd whereas in the days of swords and shields and so on, you'd get in and you'd close with the enemy, so you were sort of right in front of each other. Whereas as the technology increased, rifles and cannons and artillery and now of course drones, things like that, the enemy's much further away from you. You're unlikely to ever see them, or if you see them, it's some little sort of thing in the distance where you're going to shoot them from a mile away or a couple of thousand meters away, and so on. And if you look at, say, the battle at Rorke's Drift in the 1870s in what today is part of South Africa, the Zulus, between 4,000 and 5,000 Zulus, attempted to take a fortified position. It was an ad hoc fortification, but a fortified position with 100 or so British soldiers there who only had single-shot breech-load rifles. So there wasn't the machine guns or anything like that going on there. And yet the over about 24 hours, give or take, the British soldiers were shot something like 20,000 rounds, on just over 20,000 rounds from these single-shot rifles in that time. Now, it was a military supply depot, so it wasn't like they were short on ammunition, but it would probably save them at the end of the day. But they shot 20,000 rounds, but only 1,500 to 1,600, depending on whose numbers. Some say as high as 2,000, but only 1,500 or so bullets found their mark, either killing outright or injuring the Zulu warrior to the point where they may later die of their injuries or be incapacitated by them. So you're looking at a very low hit rate. Now, that's particularly interesting because the Zulus were actually charging down the British position, so they were charging en masse into the British lines, into the British rifles, and even there, the hit rate was still less than 1 in 10, 1 in 12, 1 in 15, depending on, again, whose numbers you're looking at. But and that's masked warriors charging at you, and still that's the hit rate. So imagine if they're further away and not charging or hiding, or they're camouflaged and so on. So the risk now let's come to looking at, say, the days of like the Roman armies and this sort of thing. According to sort of military experts, and there's a number of them around who've looked at this, the amount of soldiers that actually engaged in the hand-to-hand fighting, got this idea of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people sort of mass charging at each other and hacking away, and so it wasn't really like that in the real world. Only about 20% of the Roman soldiers actually engaged in the hand-to-hand combat. Typically, fairly early on, or at some point in the exercise, the other side would break and run, and that's when the other 80% of the soldiers were really engaged in pursuit. So they would chase them down and try and kill as many of them as they could, and that sort of. So the risk at that time, when the other side was running for the hills, the risk was very, very low. But there's only a small percentage of people were prepared to take the risks and do the heavy lifting and do the hard yards in a very high risk situation. Again, you might get killed. And the casualties there. So say a Roman army of for example, 10,000, let's say, really 2,000 are the ones that are doing the risky frontline fighting, and of those, 20 to 25% will die or will be maimed. So you've got a pretty decent chance of being killed, and it's the most experienced and most confident, and some may be ideologically predisposed, I suppose, but generally it's the most confident, most capable. So it's only 20%. Now I want to take that risk reward concept to looking at opposing and questioning globalization today. The main risk to the globalists come from the straight white males in society. They're the ones that are questioned. They'll be the biggest losers from globalization, and they're the ones that most believe that power should be shared with the citizenry, and they should select their government, select their representatives to represent them. And the globalists know this. So about 20% of the Western population, not necessarily just the better educated straight white males, but the straight white males that believe in the system. Some that are not straight white males, like Douglas Murray as an example. He's a great warrior, I think, opposing much of the globalist project, but nonetheless, there's only a small proportion really of the population, 25% at most, and those are the ones that the globalists are viciously pursuing and aggressively pursuing. They're all neo-Nazis, they're all Hitler, and they're all white supremacists, yada yada. But so they're the ones, they're the danger. But the behaviour to oppose globalisation is high risk. If you're sitting in front of the human resources manager at the play, maybe you're applying for a job or something, but or maybe it's your annual performance review. If you say, well, I disagree with mass migration and I disagree with affirmative action and appointing black lesbians to jobs that they're not qualified for, you mention that, then you're straight away, you're a Nazi, you're out of here, buddy. And they'll just find a way of getting rid of you. That also put the word around that you are a damn fascist Nazi, quite possibly Hitler, and you'll find it really tough to get employment. If you make a song and dance about it, if you query your bank and say, how come you got so many gay lesbian flags around, then you've got a good chance the bank's going to contact you and say, hey, you're being denied banking services, and then they'll communicate to other banks that you've got an issue with banks being activist, and then they may deny you services, and so on. So the risk is actually very high. You can put it out on social media that you disagree with globalization, or you have questions about it, legitimate questions, but they're not sharing power. The globalists aren't sharing power; they are imposing it upon you. And if you even question them, then you're defying them. If you're defying them, then you are fucking Hitler, and that's it. So we've got a situation here where the amount of people who are prepared to take some risk is the pool of people is diminishing because the risks are so great. Particularly, you've got people that are depending on you. For example, dependent children or something like that. Then they'll come after them if necessary. But as we're seeing in Britain now with Nigel Farage, where he's being denied banking services because he's not a good little flunky globalist, and they've also gone after his relatives and denied them banking services. I mean, for fuck's sake. So it's a high risk. It's a high risk game, and we're looking at the proportionality of risk is the same in this ideological battle as, I believe, the ideological battle as it was in a military sense, where to question or to get involved in the higher risk type work, the frontline sort of trip, that there's only a certain amount of people prepared to do it, and they've got a high risk sort of profile in pursuing that. And I think we're looking at exactly the same thing, ideological rather than military. We're looking exactly the same thing today for those that question or oppose the globalist project. So coming now to risk reward. I've got a small channel here, so my risk is, in the overall scheme of things, is fairly low. But my feeling at the moment is, with YouTube saying that they won't stop people questioning the election or COVID and that sort of stuff. I think what's happening now is that the social media landscape, they're trying to flush out everybody who is questioning or opposing globalisation. So they've got a complete list of those people. And the higher profile ones like the Nigel Farages or Donald Trump or these sort of people, they'll try and take them out completely. But for the lower level ones that are more minor irritants, and from their point of view, if you convince even one other person that the globalist project is questionable, then you are an enemy. You are an enemy of the ideology, and you have to be shut down and stopped. So I think they want to flush out as many as they can by pretending to go easy on the restrictions, just so they can have all the names and all the addresses and so on, and come after people at their leisure at some future time, to do sort of a universal shutting down of all voices. I don't know that's what they're going to do, but that was very much the Soviet way when they took over, Eastern Europe. They would say, let's have a town hall meeting. Let voice your opinion. We are for the people. The people, and let's and of course, folks would turn up at the meeting believing the meeting to be genuine, and they would voice their opinions, and the secret police would quietly take note of. What's your name? Billy Bob Smith. Where do you live? 99 Jones Street. Okay, thank you, Billy Bob. And then Billy Bob would get a knock on the door at 2 o'clock in the morning, and he'd be whisked away by the secret police, never to be seen again. Because Billy Bob, by mere virtue of he was thinking independently, merely by the virtue he's prepared to voice well-reasoned, well-considered, well-thought-out arguments on key issues, he was an enemy of the state. There's only one source of information and truth, and we heard this during the COVID thing. We are your one source of truth. And that's about as tyrannical Soviet as you can possibly fucking get. So really, if you look at the risks and you look at the rewards are that you stop globalization, but you may not directly benefit from out of it yourself. So it has to be a rather selfless thing, and the globalists will prey on it. Well, why do this? Why go through this risk when you won't benefit? How they bought off many of the politicians in the West. That waterfront mansion and fancy jobs for your kids and your family members, that goes a long way to buying loyalty. And we see it all over the body politic now in the West. Politicians that were morons, not capable of making any sort of a decent living on their own merits, are being shoehorned into Parliament and then given waterfront mansions and so on to buy their loyalties. This is now widespread, this level of corruption, and we look at the Biden family, for goodness sakes. So when we look at this concept of risk reward in an ideological sense, we're moving into I think an area where there's only 1 in 5 of the population. There'll be nearly all men, nearly all straight white men, not all, but nearly all. And they're the ones that the globalists have to crush. So that's why they've got such a bee in their bonnet about white supremacy, and they invent all sorts of silly nonsense to push it. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.